A cargo plane circles low over the Pacific Ocean, thousands of feet above nothing but open water, and a hook drops from its belly, reaching for a falling capsule that fell from space less than an hour earlier. Inside that capsule is something no radar station, no spy on the ground, and no diplomat in Moscow could ever get their hands on: hundreds of feet of film showing the Soviet Union's most guarded military secrets, photographed from orbit while the men who built those secrets had no idea they were being watched. That is the moment this story hinges on. These files were sealed for a reason. Some, for 50 years. Tonight, they're open. What if I told you that decades before smartphones, before GPS, before anyone could imagine a photograph taken from space, the United States was already secretly mapping every missile site, every airfield, and every submarine base inside the Soviet Union? By the end of this video you will understand why the Corona program remains one of the most audacious intelligence achievements in American history, and why it worked so well that Moscow didn't even know it existed until years after it began. Before we get into it, tell me in the comments what you think mattered more in the Cold War, spies on the ground, or eyes in the sky. Because this story might change your answer. By the late 1950s, the United States faced a problem that kept its top military planners awake at night. American officials genuinely believed the Soviet Union might be building missiles and bombers faster than the US could track, a fear that became known as the missile gap, and without reliable information, decisions about national defense were being made almost blind. Congress was holding hearings about it. Newspapers were running headlines about it. Entire budgets were being shaped around a number that nobody could actually confirm, because the one thing the United States did not have was a reliable way to look behind the Iron Curtain and count. The U-2 spy plane had helped for a while, flying at altitudes above 70,000 feet, high enough that Soviet fighters and missiles supposedly couldn't touch it, photographing military installations with remarkable clarity for its time. For 4 years, the U-2 quietly gave American analysts a window into Soviet territory that no other tool could provide. But every mission carried enormous risk, and by May of 1960 that risk became reality when a U-2 flown by pilot Francis Gary Powers was shot down deep inside Soviet territory by a surface-to-air missile. Powers survived, was captured, and put on trial in Moscow in front of international media, while President Eisenhower was forced into the humiliating position of first denying the mission, then admitting the truth once the Soviets produced the wreckage and the pilot. It was one of the most embarrassing moments of the entire Cold War for the United States, and it proved, permanently, that manned reconnaissance flights over Soviet airspace could no longer be trusted to stay secret. The country needed a new way to see behind the Iron Curtain, one that didn't put a pilot's life on the line, one that couldn't be shot out of the sky, and one that the Soviets couldn't parade in front of the world's cameras. The answer came from an unlikely combination of the Air Force, the CIA, and a small group of engineers working on a project so secret that even its true purpose was hidden behind a cover story. Publicly, the program was called Discoverer, described to the American public and to Congress as a series of scientific satellites conducting biological research in space, testing how small animals and plant samples responded to conditions in orbit. It was a believable story, boring enough that almost nobody asked follow-up questions, which was exactly the point. In reality, hidden behind that cover, engineers at Lockheed and inside the CIA's newly formed Directorate of Science and Technology were building something extraordinary, a satellite capable of carrying a specially designed camera into orbit, photographing the Soviet Union from more than 100 miles above the Earth, and then ejecting the exposed film inside a small re-entry capsule designed to fall back through the atmosphere, deploy a parachute, and be snagged in mid-air by a specially modified aircraft before it ever touched the ocean below. Nothing about this had ever been done before. The system had to work perfectly on the first try in almost every sense, because there was no way to service a broken camera in orbit, no way to send a technician up to fix a jammed mechanism, and no way to simply try again if the capsule missed its target and sank 2 miles down into the Pacific. The camera itself was an engineering marvel that had to be built almost from nothing. It used a panoramic design that swept back and forth as the satellite moved, exposing long strips of specially manufactured Eastman Kodak film thin enough to fit thousands of feet of it into a container barely larger than a home refrigerator, yet strong enough to survive the vibration of launch and the extreme temperature swings of space. Early versions of the system could resolve objects on the ground roughly 40 feet across, useful but far from perfect. Engineers spent years refining the optics, the film stability, and the shutter mechanisms until later generations of the program could distinguish objects only a few feet wide from more than 100 miles up, sharp enough to identify the type of aircraft parked on a runway or the shape of a submarine hull under construction. Every ounce of the spacecraft had to be justified, because every extra pound of camera or film meant less fuel, less power, and a shorter lifespan in orbit, so the entire system became a constant balancing act between capability and physics. The early attempts were brutal, and this is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Between February 1959 and June 1960, the United States attempted this mission again and again, and it failed again and again. Rockets exploded on the launch pad in front of the very engineers who built them. Cameras malfunctioned in orbit and returned nothing but blank film. Capsules burned up on re-entry because their heat shields failed. Recovery planes flew hundreds of miles searching the open ocean for a capsule that had already sunk without a trace, carrying film that no one would ever see and secrets that would stay buried at the bottom of the Pacific. By the official count, the program failed 13 times in a row before a single mission fully succeeded, an almost unthinkable failure rate for a project consuming millions of dollars and the full attention of some of the country's best engineers. Inside the Pentagon and inside Congress, officials who had approved the funding began quietly asking whether the entire idea was even physically possible, or whether America was pouring money into a beautiful theory that simply could not be built. Some of the men working on the program later admitted they wondered the same thing, staring at another destroyed capsule, another blank roll of film, another failure report that had to be explained to superiors who were running out of patience. Then, in August of 1960, everything changed. On the 13th attempt, a rocket lifted off, a satellite reached orbit, a camera captured its images, and a capsule ejected exactly on schedule. It fell back through the atmosphere, deployed its parachute at the calculated altitude, and was caught in mid-air over the Pacific Ocean by a recovery aircraft on the very first attempt of that specific mission. Inside that small capsule was more photographic coverage of the Soviet Union than every single U-2 flight of the previous 4 years combined. One successful mission, in a matter of days, had gathered more intelligence than years of the riskiest manned reconnaissance program the United States had ever run. The recovery itself deserves its own moment, because it was every bit as difficult as getting the camera into orbit in the first place. Specially modified Air Force JC-130 Hercules aircraft, crewed by pilots trained for one of the strangest jobs in the entire military, waited over a designated stretch of the Pacific for a capsule falling from an altitude higher than any airliner would ever fly. The capsule had only a narrow window of time before it would sink permanently beneath the waves, so the recovery plane had to intercept a parachute descending at a precise speed, in a precise location, and physically snag it in midair using a trailing hook and cable stretched behind the aircraft. If the first pass failed, a Navy recovery ship waited as a backup, ready to pull the capsule from the ocean before saltwater and pressure could destroy the film inside. Every single mission was, in effect, a small miracle of timing, repeated more than 100 times over 12 years, largely without the American public ever knowing it was happening at all. What that film revealed changed the way the United States understood its greatest rival. The missile gap that had haunted American planners for years, driven congressional budgets, and shaped presidential campaign speeches, turned out to be almost the opposite of what everyone feared. Soviet missile forces were smaller, less numerous, and far less advanced than American intelligence estimates had claimed, and for the first time, U.S. officials could make decisions about national defense based on evidence instead of assumption and fear. Over the following years, Corona satellites photographed thousands of targets across the Soviet Union and its allies. Missile silos hidden in remote fields that Soviet planners believed no outsider would ever locate. Submarine construction yards along the northern coastline. Nuclear test facilities in isolated regions of Kazakhstan. Military airbases, radar installations, and troop deployments that Moscow considered completely invisible to the outside world. Every photograph was a piece of a puzzle that had been impossible to complete just a few years earlier, and every mission added to a picture of Soviet military capability so detailed that analysts could count individual aircraft on a runway from images taken over 100 miles above the Earth. None of it would have mattered without the people waiting on the other end. Once the film was recovered, it was rushed to a secretive facility that became known as the National Photographic Interpretation Center, where analysts, many of them young officers trained to read the ground from directly overhead, spent countless hours hunched over light tables with magnifying equipment, studying strip after strip of film for anything unusual. They learned to recognize a missile transporter by the shadow it cast at a certain time of day, to tell a decoy installation from a real one by subtle differences in construction patterns, and to spot new activity simply by comparing this month's photographs to last month's. It was slow, exhausting, meticulous work, but it turned raw film into the kind of specific, actionable intelligence that could be placed directly in front of the President of the United States. That capability proved its worth in October of 1962, when American intelligence needed to understand exactly what the Soviet Union was building in Cuba. While U-2 flights over the island captured the images that first confirmed missile sites during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the broader intelligence picture of Soviet capability that allowed American officials to assess the real strategic balance, and to know how far they could push Moscow without triggering a war neither side could win, rested heavily on the years of Corona coverage already sitting in American archives. Having a reliable, ongoing picture of Soviet strength, rather than a single risky snapshot, gave American leadership the confidence to negotiate from a position built on evidence during the most dangerous confrontation of the entire Cold War. The most remarkable part of this achievement is how long it stayed hidden, not just from the Soviet public, but from the Soviet government itself. Corona operated from 1960 until 1972, flying over 145 missions across 12 years, and for most of that time the Soviet Union had no clear picture of what the program actually was or how much of their territory had already been photographed and catalogued. Soviet counterintelligence spent enormous resources searching for the human sources they assumed had to exist somewhere inside their own military, convinced that only a spy on the ground could be feeding this level of detail to Washington. They interrogated officers, tightened security around sensitive facilities, and hunted for a mole that, in the case of Corona's imagery, simply did not exist. The real answer was quietly orbiting above their heads the entire time, invisible, silent, and completely outside the reach of any counterintelligence operation designed to catch a human being. While the American public believed Discoverer was a modest science project barely worth a headline, the most consequential intelligence program of the early Cold War was flying over Soviet territory roughly once a month. It would take decades, until the program was finally declassified in February of 1995 by an executive order, before the American public learned the full scope of what Corona had accomplished. By the time those files were opened, Corona had already helped shape nearly every major defense decision made during the most dangerous years of the Cold War, from arms control negotiations to nuclear strategy, all built on a foundation of intelligence that the men and women involved were legally forbidden from discussing, even with their own families, for over 30 years. Even the organization running the satellites was itself a secret. The National Reconnaissance Office, the agency created to oversee Corona and the reconnaissance programs that followed it, operated for over 3 decades without its own existence being officially acknowledged by the United States government. Its name did not appear in budget documents that the public could see. Employees could not tell friends or extended family what agency they worked for, only that it was government service in a general sense. It was one of the most heavily guarded secrets in the history of American intelligence, not the details of any single mission, but the very existence of the organization running dozens of them. And the engineering legacy of Corona didn't disappear when the program ended in 1972. The lessons learned about optics, orbital mechanics, and film recovery fed directly into the reconnaissance satellites that followed it, and indirectly into the civilian satellite imaging technology that, decades later, would let ordinary people zoom into a map on their phone and see their own house from space, a capability that traces its lineage back to engineers trying to solve an impossible problem for a country that desperately needed to see behind a wall of secrecy. What makes this story remarkable is not just the technology, though the numbers alone are staggering. Over 800,000 images were captured across the life of the program. More than 500,000 feet of film was flown into orbit, exposed over hostile territory, and successfully recovered without a single Soviet interception. A program that began with 13 consecutive failures, that nearly got cancelled more than once, ended up becoming one of the most valuable intelligence tools the United States has ever built, one that some historians argue prevented a nuclear arms race built on fear from spiraling into something far worse, simply by replacing guesswork with hard evidence. What makes it remarkable is the persistence behind it. After 13 consecutive failures, most programs in most governments would have been quietly shut down and forgotten, filed away as an expensive lesson in ambition outrunning capability. Instead, American engineers kept refining the heat shields, kept redesigning the parachutes, kept training the recovery pilots, and kept solving one impossible problem after another until a machine built in near total secrecy was flying above a rival superpower and bringing home answers that no spy on the ground, no matter how well placed, could ever have obtained. It is a reminder that some of the greatest victories of the Cold War were not won with weapons at all, but with patience, engineering, and the simple refusal to accept defeat after failure number 12. So, what do you think? Was Corona the single most important intelligence program of the Cold War, or do you know another operation that deserves that title? Let me know in the comments below, and if stories like this one, real declassified missions that shaped history and reminded the world what American ingenuity could accomplish, are the kind of thing you want more of, make sure to subscribe to Spy Tales, leave a like, and turn on notifications, because there are a lot more classified files waiting to be opened.